Renee Castillo had taken the Mountain Pass Road specifically because her map application had promised it would save her nearly 2 hours compared to the longer highway route. A detail that had seemed considerably more important that particular Thursday than any concern about the road's relative isolation, given that she was already running late for a job interview in the valley town on the pass's far side. An interview she'd driven 3 hours to attend and couldn't afford to arrive at anything less than properly prepared and reasonably composed. She hadn't planned to stop at the small ranger station, tucked into a bend of the mountain road, a modest wooden structure that looked, from her brief glimpse through her windshield as she passed, like it had been standing in that particular spot for considerably longer than the surrounding Forest Service signage suggested the current staffing arrangement had existed. She noticed it only because her car's engine, which had been running with a faint but persistent rattling sound for the better part of the preceding week, that she'd been telling herself she'd get properly looked at once her current employment situation stabilized enough to justify the expense, chose that exact stretch of remote mountain road to escalate from concerning noise into genuine mechanical failure. The car coasted to a stop, perhaps a quarter-mile past the ranger station, engine dead and refusing every attempt to restart it. And Renee sat behind the wheel for a long moment, working through the particular frustration of watching an already difficult day become considerably more complicated by circumstances entirely beyond her control. She walked back toward the ranger station, understanding it represented her best and possibly only hope of finding cell signal or assistance in a stretch of mountain road that had shown, across the preceding 20 minutes of driving, no other sign of habitation or passing traffic whatsoever. The station, when she reached it, appeared to be currently unstaffed, its door unlocked in the particular way remote Forest Service outposts sometimes remained accessible to stranded travelers, even when their assigned ranger was out on patrol or otherwise occupied elsewhere in their considerable jurisdiction. Renee let herself in, calling out an announcement of her presence that received no response, and found herself standing in a modest, practical office space equipped with radio communication equipment considerably more robust than the cell signal her own phone had entirely failed to locate. It was while searching for any indication of how to properly operate the radio equipment to call for assistance that Renee noticed the logbook sitting open on the station's main desk, its pages filled with the careful, methodical entries she assumed represented the ranger's ongoing record of patrol activities, weather observations, and whatever other administrative business a remote mountain outpost required documented. She wouldn't have thought twice about the logbook's contents, beyond a passing curiosity about the routine of a job considerably different from her own recent unemployment. If her eye hadn't caught, scanning the book's most recent entries in search of any indication of when the ranger might be expected to return, a specific entry that stopped her attention entirely. 3 days ago, the entry's date confirmed, in handwriting that matched the log's other careful entries, was a single line that read, without any apparent context or explanation, "Need to be ready." Renee stood staring at this entry for a long moment, understanding, with a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air's genuine cold, that she had arrived at this exact remote station, on this exact stretch of isolated road, precisely 3 days after someone had apparently written down an expectation of exactly this kind of arrival, with no obvious explanation for how they could have possibly known, 3 days in advance, that she would be the one to eventually walk through that door. She told herself in the moment that the coincidence, however unsettling, likely admitted some perfectly mundane explanation she simply wasn't yet aware of. Perhaps the ranger was expecting some other visitor entirely, a colleague, or a scheduled inspection, and her own unplanned arrival simply happened to align, through pure chance, with an entry that had nothing whatsoever to do with her specific presence. But the entry's phrasing nagged at her, even as she worked to dismiss its apparent significance. The particular specificity of "she's coming," rather than any more generic reference to an expected visitor. The evident urgency implied by "need to be ready," that suggested whatever preparation the ranger had anticipated, carried weight considerably beyond routine administrative expectation. She continued searching the station for any way to properly call for roadside assistance, eventually locating a hand-cranked emergency radio that appeared designed for exactly this kind of situation, and worked through its unfamiliar operation with the particular determination of someone increasingly eager to resolve her immediate practical problem before allowing herself to properly process whatever unsettling coincidence the logbook's entry had introduced into an already difficult day. It was while she was still working through the radio's operation, trying to establish contact with whatever Forest Service dispatch channel might connect her to actual assistance, that the station's door opened behind her, and Renee turned to find herself facing a man she assumed, from his practical uniform and evident familiarity with the space, must be the ranger whose logbook she'd been reading without permission. He was perhaps 40, weathered in the particular way of someone who spent considerable time outdoors in demanding conditions, and his expression, upon seeing her standing at his desk with his logbook open before her, shifted through a rapid sequence of emotions that Renee found genuinely difficult to properly categorize in the moment. Surprise, certainly, at finding an unexpected visitor in his station, but also something that looked disconcertingly like a recognition considerably more specific than the situation should reasonably have permitted. "You're here," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made clear this wasn't simply the ordinary greeting of a ranger discovering an unexpected visitor. "I wasn't certain exactly when, but I knew you'd come." Renee stared at the ranger for a long moment, the radio equipment forgotten in her hands, working through a disorientation that had shifted in the space of his simple statement from mere unsettling coincidence into something considerably more difficult to explain away. "I'm sorry," she said carefully, "but I think there's some misunderstanding. My car broke down about a quarter mile up the road. I came here looking for help, calling for assistance, that's all. I don't think we've ever met before." "We haven't," the ranger confirmed, his own evident confusion mixing with something that looked, to Renee's careful observation, like a man working through implications he hadn't fully anticipated, despite whatever preparation his logbook entry suggested he'd been attempting to make. "My name's Daniel Hargrove. I've been the ranger assigned to this station for going on 6 years now. And I confess, I don't have a clear explanation for how I knew, 3 days ago, that I needed to be ready for someone's arrival, only that I woke up that particular morning with a certainty about it that I haven't been able to properly shake since, regardless of how thoroughly it defies any rational explanation I can offer." "You wrote that entry in your logbook," Renee said, understanding, even as she said it, that she was essentially confirming she'd been reading his private records without permission, though the situation's evident strangeness seemed to override whatever ordinary etiquette concerns might otherwise apply. "3 days ago. She's coming. Need to be ready. I saw it when I was looking for information about how to reach you or call for help." "I did," Daniel confirmed, settling into the chair across from where Renee still stood near his desk, his own composure visibly working to process a situation that seemed, from his careful, measured reactions, to genuinely exceed his own understanding of what he'd actually expected when he'd written that unusual entry. "How?" Renee asked, the single word carrying the full weight of her confusion, and if she was honest with herself, a growing unease that went beyond simple curiosity into something closer to genuine fear. "I don't fully know," Daniel admitted. "I've had 3 days to think about it, and I still don't have an answer that sounds entirely reasonable, even to my own ears. I woke up that particular morning with a feeling I can only describe as absolute certainty. Not a hunch, not a vague premonition, but a specific, undeniable knowledge that someone would be arriving at this station, that their arrival would matter considerably, and that I needed to prepare myself, however I understood that preparation to mean, for whatever their arrival would bring." "Prepare for what, specifically?" Renee asked, understanding that whatever explanation Daniel could offer, it would need to account for a specificity that felt, given her own unplanned, entirely coincidental arrival at this exact remote station, almost impossibly precise. "I don't know that either," Daniel said, something genuinely troubled entering his voice for the first time since he'd first spoken, That's what makes this entire situation so difficult for me to properly explain, even to myself. I've spent 3 days trying to understand what specific preparation my own certainty was actually calling for, and I haven't arrived at any clear answer, beyond simply maintaining a heightened awareness that something significant was approaching. Renee sat down slowly across from him, her earlier urgency about her broken-down car and her missed job interview receding, for the moment, behind the considerably stranger problem now occupying her full attention. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened to you," she said, some instinct telling her, from the particular weary familiarity in Daniel's tone, that this wasn't an entirely unprecedented experience for him. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that suggested he was weighing exactly how much of his own history he was prepared to share with a stranger whose arrival had already proven considerably stranger than any ordinary encounter this remote station typically produced. "No," he admitted finally, "it's happened before, though not often, and never with quite this specific a certainty about the timing. I've worked this station for 6 years, and across that time, I've had perhaps 4 or 5 occasions where I experienced something similar, a certainty about an approaching event that I couldn't rationally explain, that proved in each case to correspond to something genuinely significant that followed." "What kind of events?" Renee asked, genuinely uncertain whether she wanted to hear the answer, even as she found herself unable to stop asking the questions that continued building between them. "A forest fire, 3 years back, that I somehow knew was coming a full day before any weather service warning or lightning strike report gave any conventional indication of the risk," Daniel said. "A hiker who went missing on this same mountain 2 years ago, whom I found, against considerable odds, because some inexplicable certainty led me directly to a section of trail I had no ordinary reason to search first. I've learned, across these 6 years, not to dismiss these particular certainties when they arrive, however uncomfortable their lack of rational explanation makes me." "And this time," Renee said slowly, "the certainty was about me. About my arrival, specifically, 3 days before my car happened to break down on this exact stretch of road." "It appears so," Daniel said, something in his careful, measured tone suggesting he found this specific implication considerably more unsettling than his previous experiences with similar unexplained certainty. "Which raises a question I confess I don't have any comfortable answer to, Ms. Castillo," Renee supplied. "Renee Castillo." "Ms. Castillo," Daniel continued, "which is, what specifically is it about your arrival that my own inexplicable certainty judged significant enough to warrant 3 days of preparation I still don't fully understand the nature of?" The days that followed brought Renee and Daniel into an increasingly careful, methodical investigation of exactly what significance her arrival might actually hold, an investigation complicated considerably by the practical reality that Renee's car remained genuinely disabled, requiring several additional days before a proper tow truck could make the difficult journey up the mountain pass to retrieve it. Days that Renee found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, spending largely at the ranger station itself, working alongside Daniel to understand a mystery that had by this point thoroughly displaced her original concerns about her missed job interview and her broader employment uncertainty. "I keep coming back to the timing," Daniel said, on the second day of what had become their shared, careful investigation, the two of them working through his station's considerable records in search of any pattern that might explain his previous instances of unexplained premonition, alongside this current, more personally specific example. "Every previous occasion, the certainty I experienced connected to some genuine emergency, a fire, a missing person, circumstances where my particular knowledge and skills as a ranger proved directly relevant to resolving the situation. But your arrival, so far as I can tell, doesn't connect to any obvious emergency beyond the mundane mechanical failure of your car." "Unless the significance hasn't happened yet," Renee said, a thought that had been building in her own mind across their days of careful investigation. "What if whatever your certainty was actually anticipating hasn't occurred yet? What if my car breaking down was simply the mechanism that brought me here, and the actual significant event your premonition was preparing you for is still ahead of us. Daniel considered this possibility with evident unease, the particular careful stillness of a man working through implications he found genuinely uncomfortable to properly confront. That's a considerably more troubling possibility than I'd allowed myself to consider, he admitted. If you're right, then whatever preparation my certainty was actually calling for hasn't yet been properly completed, which means we're currently operating without full understanding of what circumstance we're actually meant to be ready for. They spent the following days working through every possible angle of investigation their combined resources could provide. Renee's own careful account of her recent history and current circumstances, searching for anything that might connect to Daniel's particular skills or the station's specific jurisdiction. Daniel's considerable knowledge of the surrounding mountain terrain and its various hazards, searching for any indication of an emerging danger that might explain the urgency his premonition had apparently anticipated. It was on the fourth day, Renee's car finally retrieved by a tow truck that had made the difficult mountain journey specifically to haul it to a proper repair shop in the valley town below, that the actual significance of Daniel's premonition finally revealed itself, in a manner that neither of them had properly anticipated, despite their days of careful, methodical investigation. A second radio call came through to the station that afternoon, from a hiking party some considerable distance up the mountain's more remote backcountry trails, reporting a companion who had fallen and sustained a serious injury in terrain difficult enough that the reporting hiker's own limited first aid knowledge and the party's inability to properly carry their injured companion out under their own power left them genuinely uncertain how to proceed without professional rescue assistance. Daniel took the call with the practiced efficiency of a man well accustomed to exactly this kind of emergency. But Renee, watching him work through the radio's static-filled details, noticed something in his expression shift as the reporting hiker described their injured companion's specific condition: a fractured leg, considerable blood loss from an accompanying wound, and, most critically, a blood type that the hiking party, in their evident panic, had somehow thought relevant enough to mention, despite its apparent irrelevance to Daniel's immediate rescue logistics. AB negative, Daniel repeated, once the call had concluded, his expression carrying a weight that told Renee something significant had just clicked into place for him. Considerably rarer than most people realize, and not one this particular valley's small hospital typically maintains sufficient supply of for emergency transfusion needs. Is that relevant? Renee asked, uncertain what connection Daniel had apparently drawn between this detail and their preceding days of investigation. It might be, Daniel said slowly, if it happens to match your own blood type, which is a detail you mentioned, almost in passing, during our conversation yesterday about your own medical history. Renee felt a chill work through her, understanding, even before Daniel fully articulated the implication, exactly what connection he was drawing between her own presence at this remote station and the injured hiker, whose condition had just been reported over his radio. I am AB negative, she confirmed. But surely that's just another coincidence. There's no way you could have anticipated, 3 days ago, that a hiking accident would occur today, requiring a blood type that happened to match mine specifically. I don't know how to explain it, Daniel admitted, but I've learned, across 6 years of these unexplained certainties, not to dismiss connections simply because I can't rationally account for their mechanism. If this injured hiker requires a transfusion the local hospital can't properly supply, and you happen to be here, with exactly the blood type needed, at exactly the moment this emergency has developed, I don't think that's coincidence, Ms. Castillo. I think that's exactly what my premonition was preparing me to be ready for. The rescue and subsequent emergency blood donation that followed unfolded with a speed that left Renee, in retrospect, genuinely amazed at how quickly circumstance had transformed her from a stranded traveler, nursing a broken-down car, into an unexpected participant in what the local hospital's attending physician would later describe, with considerable professional gratitude, as a genuinely life-saving intervention. The injured hiker, a young man named Peter Voss, whose fall had resulted in a fractured leg and a laceration considerably more severe than his hiking party had initially understood. Required, once the rescue helicopter Daniel had helped coordinate finally delivered him to the Valley Hospital some hours later. A blood transfusion at the hospital's limited supply of his rare blood type proved genuinely inadequate to properly provide. Renee's own donation, offered readily once the full urgency of the situation became clear to her, proved sufficient to stabilize Peter through the critical period before additional supply could be transported from a larger regional blood bank. A contribution that the attending physician made clear, in careful conversation with both Renee and Daniel afterward, had likely made the genuine difference between Peter's full recovery and considerably more serious, potentially fatal complications from his blood loss. "I don't understand how any of this actually happened," Renee said, sitting with Daniel in the hospital's modest waiting area once Peter's condition had been properly stabilized, working through the full, remarkable chain of coincidence, or perhaps something considerably more significant than mere coincidence, that had brought her to this exact moment. 3 days ago, you knew someone was coming. Somehow, that someone turned out to be me, someone whose specific blood type happened to be exactly what was needed for an emergency that hadn't even occurred yet at the time you wrote that entry. "I don't have a rational explanation either," Daniel admitted. "I've spent 6 years experiencing these particular certainties without ever fully understanding their mechanism, only learning through repeated experience that dismissing them tends to prove considerably more costly than simply trusting them, however uncomfortable that trust makes me feel, given how thoroughly it defies ordinary explanation." "Does it happen to everyone who works remote enough postings?" Renee asked, genuine curiosity now mixing with her earlier unease. "Or is there something specific about you that seems to generate these particular experiences?" "I've never discussed this particular aspect of my work with any of my colleagues, understanding, correctly I suspect, that most people would respond with exactly the kind of rational skepticism that would make continuing in this profession considerably more difficult if it became widely known I experienced these unexplained certainties. You're the first person I've ever properly discussed this with, largely because your own arrival made discussing it considerably more necessary than my usual preference for simply keeping the experience private." Renee found herself, across the following weeks, developing a genuine friendship with Daniel that grew gradually out of their shared experience of this remarkable unexplained event. She returned to the mountain station periodically, once her car had been properly repaired, and her delayed job interview rescheduled with an understanding employer, once she'd explained the genuine emergency that had prevented her original attendance, had resulted in the position she'd originally traveled to the valley to pursue. "I keep thinking about the actual mechanism," she told Daniel, during one such visit some 2 months after their remarkable first encounter, the two of them sitting together on the station's modest porch, watching the mountain evenings settle into dusk. "How you could have possibly known, 3 days before my car broke down, that I would arrive here, and that my specific blood type would matter to an emergency that hadn't yet occurred. It doesn't fit any rational framework I can construct, no matter how many times I try to work through the logic of it." "I've given up trying to fully explain it," Daniel admitted. "I've come to understand, across these 6 years, that some things genuinely defy rational explanation, and that the healthiest response isn't necessarily forcing an explanation to fit, but simply accepting that certain experiences exist outside whatever framework I'd otherwise prefer to understand my own life through." "Does it frighten you?" Renee asked, "having this ability, or whatever we should properly call it, knowing things are coming without understanding how or why you know them?" Daniel considered this question with evident care before answering. "It used to," he admitted. "In my earlier years at this station, before I'd learned to trust these particular certainties, I found the experience genuinely unsettling, precisely because it defied every rational framework my training had taught me to rely upon. But I've come to understand, across the years since, that whatever mechanism produces these certainties, it has consistently proven itself trustworthy, has consistently led me toward outcomes that mattered genuinely. A fire properly contained before it could spread. A missing hiker properly found before exposure claimed him. And now, a stranger whose arrival happened to coincide with exactly the resource an emergency required. I've stopped needing to understand the mechanism, Renee, and started simply trusting the pattern. Renee thought about this for a long moment, watching the mountain evening deepen around them, understanding that whatever remarkable, unexplained circumstance had brought her to this particular station on this particular day, it had led her ultimately toward both a genuine act of significant help for a stranger whose life had depended on her presence, and a friendship with a man whose careful, patient trust in circumstances beyond rational explanation had, she found herself increasingly convinced, something genuinely valuable to teach her about her own approach to a life she'd previously insisted on understanding entirely through conventional, rational frameworks. "I think," she said finally, "I'm glad my car broke down exactly when and where it did, however strange the reasons behind that timing might ultimately prove to be." "So am I," Daniel said, something warm and genuine in his voice that went considerably beyond simple professional gratitude for her unexpected, life-saving contribution to Peter Voss's recovery.